Hi, everyone. I hope you've all had a wonderful summer so far. I first of all just wanted to say thank you to everybody who watched my YouTube lecture from a few weeks ago. And now I'm back to answer a few questions about the material and to kind of mirror the Q&A section that would have happened in a live lecture. So first, I will share my screen. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about is exactly what pollen is. So pollen is part of the plant reproductive process. So it's an important step in being able to create more plants. And the pollen grains are made out of a substance called sporopollenin, which is a biopolymer. So it's a substance that the plant produces, and it's very hard and tough. So what it does is protects the pollen grain, and it makes sure that all the genetic material that's inside of it stays alive and stays viable so that it is able to fertilize other plants, which is lucky for archaeologists who are using it to study the environment, because that means that the pollen stays preserved for a very long time. So pollen doesn't preserve everywhere. It preserves best in dry environments and in wetlands where it's kind of protected from weather and from bacteria. So harsh weather, especially in our kind of environment in Massachusetts, where it gets very hot and it gets very cold depending on the seasons, that can be really hard on the pollen and it can make it break. And the same with bacteria, where it can eat it away. So the pollen preserves best in those environments where it's protected from those. And it's the polymer sporopollenin that has the different shapes that we can then identify, and what makes it actually preserve and what makes us able to look at it. And a few more examples of what pollen looks like. So these are 4 different species, all of which I have been able to observe in my own sample, not necessarily from Plymouth, but especially the sunflower and the wheat I saw when I was doing my master's thesis in New Mexico. So another thing that I don't think I mentioned before is that these pollen grains are microscopic. So you can see it with your naked eye, you can see it on your car in the spring, but if you want to see the actual individual grains, you can only do that with a microscope at 400 magnification. So these are really, 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 really tiny. So you need to have a lot of them to be able to actually see it. So yes, I showed these. These are some of my favorites. And so I hope you enjoy these photos. And another thing that I should actually point out is that there are 2 different types of cameras that have taken these photos. So the 2 that are in black and white are taken with a scanning electron microscope, which is a very powerful microscope that's often used in medical research, actually, to be able to get really, really detailed pictures of microscopic objects. So I have not been able to use one. It would be really exciting to be able to use one. And then the other 2 in color are taken with a regular microscope camera, so a little bit less fancy. But still, it's still, that's what I usually use, good for my purposes. You're still able to see the pollen in pretty good detail. But the scanning electron microscope ones are very cool. Okay, so another thing I thought I'd mention is kind of some interesting things that we found in Plymouth, and I thought I'd talk about one of my favorite finds, which is an almost completely intact calf skeleton that we found on Burial Hill. So over the years, we've found little bits of bone. Usually bone doesn't preserve super well for the same reason that pollen sometimes doesn't preserve well in temperate environments, because it gets damaged by the cold and the hot cycles. So it was very, very exciting to be able to find an almost intact calf. So there were some parts of the calf that were missing, and we're not exactly sure why. And it's interesting to find this almost intact animal, because that means that nobody ate it. So we're not really sure what happened with this calf that she was buried whole. Another thing that's interesting about this calf skeleton is that we know we can date her. because we know that the English colonists were the ones who brought cattle and that Native people did not have cattle. So we know that she's from at least 1620. So everything around her is also from at least 1620, which is also something that's exciting. And we affectionately named her Constance. So whenever we're talking about this calf skeleton, we always refer to her as Constance by her proper name. So I was not one of the ones who first found Constance, but I was there in the field season and I got to see as she was being excavated. And these are some photos from that. You can see how complete she is. And how carefully we had to excavate her so that we knew exactly what position her bones were in. So that is something that was really exciting, that we're still kind of uncovering the mysteries of, and we're trying to unravel the story of Constance the calf in Plymouth. So another thing that I thought I'd discuss in more detail is native agriculture. So what the Wampanoag would have been growing in Massachusetts. So corn, beans, and squash, as I mentioned in the first lecture, were some of the most important plants, not only in New England, but also across the Americas, were some of the three most widely consumed native North American plants. So these three plants are often grown together, and in quite a few places they're known as the three sisters because they're so closely associated. And this also refers to a specific type of agriculture wherein the corn stalks would support the beans and then the squash would be grown around it. So this kind of created a really good partnership among these three plants that were then important to the human diet. So all three of these plants would have looked different than they do in the grocery store now. So now when you get corn, it's usually yellow or white, but back then it would have been a lot of different colors. So there would have been some blue, purple, kind of like reddish. It would have been this really beautiful multicolored corn and not just necessarily the yellow and white varieties. There would have been lots of different varieties. And the same is with squash and beans as well. So based on the research that I was able to do in preparation for this, I found that winter squash seemed to be more commonly grown than summer squashes. So more like butternut or acorn squash with a hard skin. And it seemed like kind of like zucchini was less common. And string beans seem to be common. So things like scarlet runner beans, that kind of bean. So a lot of these varieties are actually still preserved today, and people still grow them. And you may have heard of heirloom seeds. So those are varieties that have existed for a very long time and have been preserved by people over time that you can still plant today. So I did a little research on some more kind of seeds that are available as heirlooms. And these are some pictures I found, so you can see like especially that corn there, that really beautiful kind of like dark purple corn. And this is a list of some indigenous owned companies that I found that actually have these seeds. And you can actually grow them yourself, and I really enjoyed looking through all the photos of all the different kinds of plants. It's really beautiful, especially when you kind of go into your grocery store and everything all looks the same. You can see like what huge variety we have in some of these plants. And another thing I thought I'd mention is about the colonial and Native North American diet. So overall, you could live a healthy life on this kind of food, on both the Native North American types of food as well as English colonial. But as we know, kind of in the past, health was just not as good as it is now, especially when it comes to infectious disease. Of course, now we have antibiotics, we have all sorts of medicine. Back then that didn't exist, so that of course impacted health in a lot of ways. But kind of like aside from that, just kind of focusing on the food, by many accounts, the Native North Americans were very healthy and were sustained their populations on a really healthful diet. And that's partly because of how varied their diet would have been, especially in North America, or especially in the Northeast, where agriculture accounted for about half of what they ate, and then the other half was from foraged material. So there would have been a lot of different plants that they would have eaten. And we know that variety is really healthy for people. It would have been different for the Europeans, especially when they were living in Europe. So back in England, people were mostly relying on agricultural crops, so large scale production of mostly cereal grains, so like especially wheat. And so when and that would have been most of what they would have eaten, and they would have relied on fewer kind of wild resources. There would have been a lot of much lower diversity and a lot more reliance on the agricultural crops. And another facet of this is of course disease. So it is very difficult to separate the two. And often the kind of the most well-known infectious diseases are associated with animal agriculture. And sort of a lot of diseases were developed alongside that. So that is something also that would have been kind of a big impact. All right. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be around this in the summer. If there are lots of questions, I can do another video, or I can email answers to any questions that you might have. So thank you so much for listening.